The 6th of June 1944, one of the most famous dates of World War II. The day when Operation Overlord was launched. This day Allied forces landed in the northern France and opened the Second Front. But what if these landings instead of the famous victory ended in a defeat? Our story begins as on 4th of June, when General Dwight Eisenhower decides not to postpone landings that were postponed since May to 6th of June, and instead he decided to launch invasion at 5th of June as planned. Very bad weather will make impossible to make full utilization of air and naval fire support, and it will also make the journey through the English Channel much more difficult. Lots of landing crafts even sink on the way to the beaches. Noticeable portion of heavy equipment will be lost, like in our timeline at Omaha Beach, before they can even intervene in the fight. Another event that changes the course of history will be Hitler's sleep. Hitler would wake up earlier that day, probably due to his infamous providence, just in time for generals to inform him about the Allied invasion. Hitler also won't be such an idiot as he is, and he will listen to advices of his generals and immediately have the troops moved from the Pays de Calais, where he thought the true invasion would begin. German divisions moves to the Normandy in order to repel the invasion. In the end, the most of the German forces in France moved to Normandy. Allies managed to maintain all of the beaches and even advance into inland France, but eventually they ended being defeated by stronger German forces after weeks of bloody fights. After the catastrophic defeat that everyone feared, General Eisenhower voluntarily resigns as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces. Two irreconcilable rivals, General George S. Patton and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, compete for his position. In the end, Montgomery is named the new Supreme Commander. It is hard for Patton to reconcile with it. Their rivalry reflects an overall small conflict between the British and the Americans. Winston Churchill, who wanted to land in the Balkans in order to weaken the Soviet influence there, eventually accuses Franklin Roosevelt for defeat in Normandy and believes that his idea was better and would be successful. Now the Italian front becomes the most important battlefield for the Western Allies in Europe. Rome is even liberated in the same time when D-Day is launched, but advance there will be difficult, even more difficult than in our timeline. D-Day is, of course, a huge victory for the Germans, most of all for their propaganda. It is that victory they all the time needed. It is, after all, a great victory for Providence of the infallible Führer, confirming the superiority of Germans. Goebbels says that now Germany only have to turn the forces from the west and to the east to defeat the Jewish Bolsheviks. Now the war is turning, and the German victory is within easy reach.
Well, the opposite is true.
In the Soviet Union, the failure of the Second Front disappoints Stalin, especially his confidence in the ability of the Allies.
Что ты не делаешь сам, у тебя нет.
On June the 23rd, the Soviet summer offensive in Belarus, codenamed Bagration, is launched. The Soviet attack led by generals
Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Vasilyevsky
over the Belarusian swamps will become the largest German defeat in their military history. 28 of the 34 Central Group divisions are surrounded and destroyed. In August, the Red Army reaches pre-war Soviet borders. The Red Army also reaches Baltic Sea, encircling the entire army group north in the process. In August, the Soviets continued to Poland, Romania and the Baltics. In the south, the Soviet advance to Romania results in the Romanian King Michael I overthrowing the fascist government of General
Antonescu
and joining the war on the side of Allies. Similar event happens in Bulgaria. The Red Army continued to advance in the Balkans. Yugoslavia, Albania and northern Greece are liberated. The rest of Greece is liberated by the British. In Greece, communists and royalists will soon start to fight each other, starting the Greek Civil War. In Poland, the Red Army will advance up to the Vistula near Warsaw. The Warsaw Uprising will still take place, as in over timeline. Since the Western Allies cannot help Poland in any way, the only Polish hope is the USSR. We know how it turned out, but this time it will be a little different. Stalin sees the uprising as a great opportunity to consolidate influence over Poland, if he will act correctly. The Red Army, together with the Polish Army and the Soviet Union, enter Warsaw to help the uprising and liberate the city. Although the uprising was mostly organized by the Polish Home Army, the Soviet Union quickly begins to refer the uprising as an event organized by the Polish Communist partisans and the Soviet Union. Most of the Home Army commanders and leader of the uprising were meanwhile arrested by the NKVD. The Polish Committee of National Liberation gains full influence over Poland, while the government in exile in London remain in London. In autumn 1944, the Red Army advanced further to Hungary. The Slovak national uprising takes place, as in our timeline. Unfortunately, with same results. The Soviet advance is slowed down a bit by German reinforcements from the west, but they have only a minor influence. In mid-December 1944, Hitler came up with a brilliant plan of counter-offensive on the Eastern Front. German forces are reinforced with reinforcements from the west. The Germans deploy their latest weapons, including heavy King Tiger tanks. The objectives of the operation the Guard on Vistula are recapture of Warsaw and the subsequent expulsion of the Soviets from Poland. As the main commander of the operation is appointed the largest German star double winner from France, and the Desert Fox Erwin Rommel, he was chosen for this duty by the Führer himself. As it turned out, winter Poland is not a pleasant environment for the Desert Fox. The Soviet defenders, knowing the German plans and having twice as much strength, easily repelled the German attack. The only thing the operation achieved, apart from the huge losses, was the complete exhaustion of German resources. Soviet forces launched the Vistula offensive during the spring, successfully pushing the Germans out of Poland and even entering German territory. The fightings continue also in the south, where the Soviet army captured Vienna in April. Czechoslovakia also sees heavy fighting between the Red Army and Wehrmacht, much bloodier than in our timeline. German decides to make Prague a fortified city. The Battle of Prague will be similar to the Battle of Budapest. The Prague uprising would take place before the Soviet arrival, but it is suppressed, mostly by the Vlasov's army, Russian Liberation Army. Prague is not liberated until late May, when the Red Army under the command of Marshal Ivan Konev finally kicked the Germans out. All of Czechoslovakia is finally liberated in the mid-June. After the liberation of Czechoslovakia, the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps in the USSR continues to fight in Germany, where it will take part, beside others, in the Battle of Munich. War in Germany itself is so dreadfully brutal that previous years of the war look relatively fine in comparison to the late war in Germany. German soldiers will not surrender to the Soviets as did to the Americans in our timeline. All of them are fanatically forced to fight, even as suicidal bombers. Those who refuse are shot and publicly hanged as traitors who collaborated with the Bolsheviks, women, old men and even children. And, well, Soviet soldiers in Germany also don't act like in velvet gloves. Add to that the many endless Allied air raids. Germany in 1945 is literally hell on earth. The greatest battle of the war begins in June 1945, the Battle of Berlin. This immense battle lasts several months and ends with a great decisive Soviet victory. With Berlin fallen, the Germans move the capital to Cologne, but it is clear that the war will soon be over. Well, not for fanatical Nazis. In the summer, the Red Army launches the Elbe offensive in central and northern Germany. Soviets mainly rush to Benelux and Denmark, which they managed to liberate in July and in the late summer, respectively. To all countries their governments returns from exile and the influence of communists increase. The famous German Wunderwaffe will, of course, be deployed. However, German secret weapons will not cause any change in the war. In the summer of 1945 the first jet fights between German Mi-262 and British Meteors take place in the sky, and Soviet IS-3 tanks make their way through Germany against the German Panthers II. When the Red Army advanced through Germany, the Allies, meanwhile, have advanced across the Po River in Italy and continue to fight the Germans in the Alps. But the main goal of both Allies and Soviets is Paris. Soviet forces advanced from the north and the Allied ones from the south. The Soviets are the first to reach French territory. The provisional government of the French Republic, consisting of the domestic resistance, mostly represented by the communists, whose president becomes Charles de Gaulle, was formed in the north. The Gaul has become more close to the Soviets since the failure of the Normandy landings, after he somehow lost faith in the British and American capability to get to France. However, in the south, many members and of the Free French forces disagree with forming of this government and consider it a betrayal and a Soviet puppet state, thus creating the Marseilles-based National Liberation Commission of France, headed by Georges Bidault. This government gets fully backed by the British and later also by Americans. Paris is finally liberated in December by the Soviets. Despite during the post-Eupine conference have been decided that France will be liberated under Free France, France ended up being divided between the authorities of two governments, whose territories are defined by the demarcation line between the USSR and the Allies. World War II finally ends in Europe on 20.2, 1946 after the capitulation of the besieged German cities, which refused to surrender until Hitler shot himself in his Alpine bunker. After the war in Europe, a conference is held in Hamburg to define the final boundaries and the arrangement of the new Europe. Here, America is already represented by Truman, since in the fall of 1945 Roosevelt died. Roosevelt lived longer, because he never had to undertake the way all the way to Yalta, which very exhausted him, because yet the conference never happened. As we can see, almost the whole Germany, besides an international zone in the north consisting mainly of Hamburg and Bremen, falls under the occupying authority of the USSR. Germany still loses the same territories as it did in our timeline and Kiel Canal. Austria is divided into two occupation zones, USSR and the British Joint Zone. In France, a referendum of unification is promised to be held, but in the end it doesn't happen until 1949, ultimately due to Churchill's and Truman's fear of communists seizing power there. What is exactly they did? Now there is the last part of the Axis to deal with Japanese Empire. Roosevelt, still alive at the time, has to make a critical decision, use or don't use nuclear weapons against Japan. He decided not to do it. Instead, Operation Downfall take place, the largest amphibious invasion of the all times. Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander in Pacific, demands the use of nuclear bombs during the invasion, but Roosevelt again refuses, and then he dies. And his successor Harry S. Truman later allows nuclear bombs to be used during the war with Japan. First nuclear bomb ever hits Japanese city Kakara at the 9th of October 1945, beginning the atomic age. But even nuclear bombs doesn't force Japan to surrender. The Americans meet immense and insane Japanese resistance. Thousands of fantasized Japanese civilians of all age are committing suicide attacks in the name of the emperor. In late stages of the war, a lot of Japanese troops changes their strategy to the guerrilla warfare. The Soviets also enters the war against Japan in June 1946, as they promised in the post-Eupine conference. They quickly destroy the weak defense of Manchuria, where the last functioning Japanese industry was placed. Soviet forces continued their advance to Korea. Korea was finally liberated in the summer of 1946 by the Red Army. Soon, the Korean government is set up under the National Liberation Committee of Korea. Resistance leader Kim Il-sung would quickly become its leader. Under him, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea would be later formed. The Japanese Empire surrendered after more than a year of heavy fights in September 1946. During Operation Downfall, United States suffered more than 1 million casualties. Japanese casualties were even higher. The Japanese islands were completely devastated and recognizable from how they used to look like. After the war, Japan was divided into 3 occupation zones. The Soviet zone, including Hokkaido, Kawai Islands, Sakhalin and part of the island of Honshu. American zone, including Kyushu and Honshu and Pacific Islands. And the British zone, including Shikoku. As soon as the war was over, President Truman turned his attention to China, where the civil war has broken out again.
End of the first episode.